runs. Even this one, even this Centurion, I'm going to be speaking about that in a moment. That will now be running, and that'll be one of our main features. Needs a little paint, needs a little cleaning up, but that's the easy part. The tough part is getting a new engine in it, the gearbox working, and all the electronics, and the whole instrument cluster and everything properly focused and running and functional. And it is. And we're going to talk about that in relationship to this one, this Chieftain. We have two Chieftains. And I've always said to the group here, what's better than having one of something? And of course, the next would be, well, let's get two of them. Well, we acquired this one here. This is a Mark 10 Chieftain. This is a Mark 11 Chieftain. And just to emphasize, it's been a progression of improvements. In fact, there's been over 1,000 improvements since when they first introduced the Chieftain in 1965.
You've got mail.
Someone's got mail. It's from Chieftain. Okay. The vehicle was utilized in the British Army and continues on in some other nations around the world. But in 1995, that's when the last Chieftain was discarded, or they call it cast. In other words, they're no longer going to service them, and they put them out to rest. Out to rest. Some of them go on as range targets, which makes us kind of cringe because we like to preserve history. But the reality is, when you have the numbers of tanks to dispose of, and if you can't sell them, Canadian government, these Leopard 1s that we have, the C2s, just like that one right there, they just finally, several months ago, decided that's it. We've heard they're going to stop service things, stop running them, because they have the Leopard 2s now, so they don't need this. So they had a fleet of these ones. It's a Leopard 1. In Canadian service, we call it a C2. They stopped, they discontinued them, and that's how we have another one coming to us. They tried to sell them to other governments. No one was buying it, so now they're disposing of them. We do have another one of those coming, being donated to us by the Canadian Armed Forces. But let's talk about this. We're here, and what I want to focus on today is kind of the evolution of British armor since World War II. Like, what happened in World War II that affected the development of armor. So, from a post-war, right after the war, in May 1945, it was about 3-4 weeks after the war ended, the first Centurion, that one right there, was seen in Europe. So it never saw action in World War II, but it was right there. So I want to talk about that, and then we'll talk about the very next British tank, which is this one. And then we'll talk about how this one, in fact, impacted the very next generation of armor, and it's significantly different. So we're almost looking like Generation 1, Generation 2, and the third generation, which has the very highly sensitive Chobram armor on it, which is a composite blend of metals and ceramics, and the way it's made, and it's highly classified. The Americans use it on their Abrams tank, but it was something that was developed in the UK, and that's what is on the outside of the Challenger 1 and the Challenger 2. So let's come back to the Centurion. At the end of World War II, prior to the end, in 1943, the British government said, we need to develop another tank. Look what they've got out there. Look at the Germans, what they've got. Look what the Russians have developed, the T-34-85, the T-34 and then the T-34-85, which you're looking at there. The big threat to the Centurion was the German 88mm. We have one right over there. Matter of fact, it's even pointing at the Centurion. I don't think that was by design, but that 88 is pointing at that Centurion right now. And you know what? That was actually one of the criteria on the armor. In 1943, the British government said, here's what we need for this thing to do. And one of them was, it has to be able to withstand a hit from an 88. So that affected the design of the armor on the front of the Centurion. And that armor, look at the slope on the front of that. That's amazing. What is it influenced by? Well, it goes back to the T-34. Sloping armor wasn't a new concept, but the Russians took it to a whole new level. But that's just one characteristic of a tank. You still got comms, you know, how do you use them? What strategy do you use? A lot of different aspects of it. But that sloping armor was taken to another level. At the front here, it's even more sloped, I believe, than what we have in the T-34. And look at what they had on the Panzer, the Panther tank, the German tank, and then the King Tiger with its sloping armor. So that was the direction they were headed. Now the Shermans, there's one of the Shermans right there. That was the very last design, the latest design that the Shermans put in, and that has a 76 high-velocity cannon. And prior to that being built, we would install we would put the British 17-pounder inside. The 17-pounder is like a high-velocity 76mm cannon. We put them on the Shermans. Well, the British wanted at least that to start on the Centurion. So it started off with the 17-pounder, then it went to a 20-pounder. The British, we tend to go millimeters as to the size. They used to, maybe they still do, refer to pounds. And then it went from a 17 to a 20-pounder, which is an 84mm. Now you're getting closer to the T-34-85's 85mm, and you get up to the 88mm, like they used in the Tiger tank, in King Tiger. It ended up going to 105mm. So my understanding is this is 105mm. You notice the muzzle, it's not a muzzle brake on the end. It's not a flash eliminator like you see on these other cannons. These don't have we have a fume extractor that minimizes it. The Sherman there, you see there's actually a flash eliminator. This just supports it so it doesn't blow the end off, because you went up to 105mm. So at the end of World War II, we had the Centurion. Canadians, we bought Centurions. We had about 300, and at the end of the day, I think there's about 370 of them in Canada. And we used them right up until we got the Leopard 1s, which I believe was about 77, 79 when they came in. So, with armor, it's action and reaction. With armor, if the Russians got something bigger, we thought, well, what are we going to do? How do we offset that? So what we're dealing with here is you had the Centurion now, even with 105mm, it was no match for some of the huge, big Russian tanks, the Joseph Stalin, the JS-2 and 3, and some of the other ones that they had out. There was no match. So the British come up with what they called the Conqueror. Now they only made, I think they made around 100. There wasn't a lot of these made, but they were huge behemoths. And they needed something big, like a gun. That's where the development of this cannon came from. 120mm, rifled, high velocity, could take out anything in the world. Still used today. Challenger 1, Challenger 2. Slightly different firing systems, upgraded, modified, but the same thing. This came out, so you had the Centurion to deal with the Russian T-55s, which were like thousands and thousands of them sitting on, on the border by the Warsaw Pact. You had all that going on. This wasn't enough to go on to take, couldn't take on the Joseph Stalins or the big ones. So they had the Conqueror, and that would be the kind of overseer. It would sit back with this big 120mm, high velocity, very accurate gun, and it would be the big brother and take care of this. Well, the race kept going on, and it was time to upgrade the Centurion. So in the late 60s, mid-60s, they said, we need something different. We need something different. So what they learned was, different countries went different ways. The British said, we want something firepower first, hence the 120 millimeter high velocity. That was priority number one. Priority number two was crew protection. They wanted heavy armor. So what the British did was they married the Conqueror and the Centurion. They looked at the traits of each, brought them together in this design. The third priority was speed and maneuverability. So what do you have here? The suspension. If you have a look there, the suspension, it's not a Christie suspension, which was frequently used. The T-34-85 had an American design Christie suspension, where you had torsion rods going inside. This doesn't. This is a Horseman two-wheel suspension. There's springs on it and it bolts onto the side. It's easy for maintenance. You take the two off, put the other two on. That's the same suspension that went on to this vehicle, this tank. The same tank suspension configuration. Designed in 43, produced in 45, and here it is 20 years later, and they brought the same modified, but the same technology over onto this. The Conqueror, the same gun. Now I talked about the weapon being the priority, armor to protect the crew, and mobility wasn't the highest priority. The Germans, with their Leopard 1s, which we're looking at over here, their first priority was mobility. These things go. If any of you were here on our tank Saturdays and you've seen the Battle Royale that we have, I love crewing one of these because these things move. You move, you hit. The second thing was the firepower, and the third thing was armor. So different priorities, different. The French had another twist at it, and they had a whole series of things that were developed in a different way. But looking at this in its life, as I said earlier, has had 1,000 changes. Started with a Mark I as a prototype, and then they went 2, 3. Productions were Mark IIIs and Mark Vs were the big production. They produced, well, this is interesting, and this is where I bought my notes, because I wanted to share some numbers with you. My head was not going to remember all these numbers. Not to be boring, but let me put things in a perspective. When you got a world war, T-34-85, between the 34s and the 34-85s, which had the upgraded turret, they made about 85,000 of those suckers. The Sherman. I'm trying to remember, it was about 50 some odd thousand, wasn't it? About 50,000 of the Shermans, one right beside it. That's during the war. The shelf life is not long. You go out there, I think the T-34, they gave them 2 to 3 weeks. That was the lifespan of it, because they were in an ongoing conflict, the fight of their lives. The Centurion. If someone says to any tank expert, I'm talking people that live, eat, and breathe it. I mean, we're in the hobby, and I love it and everything, but man, there's so many people that know so much more than I do. And they would say, that's probably one of the most successful tanks in the world. They produced about 4,400 of them total. That was it. 4,400. Canada had close to 400. It was 300 and change of it. But that was the most successful. When Canada got rid of these and went into the Leopards, who do you think we sold the Centurions to? There was a few monuments around. Israel. They put a different engine in it, they upgunned it, they were involved in the wars, you name it. Yom Kippur, every war that's been over there. There's some great stuff, tank warfare and greatest tank battles and that kind of stuff. What they've done with these, how they souped them up. They did that with the Shermans, the Israelis. Very innovative. As a matter of fact, it's funny how politics play so much involved with in tank development. When they were looking at developing this vehicle, one of the initial players was Israel. Israel actually wanted to license this and produce this in Israel. And then due to politics at the time, And there was a lot of stuff going on between, you know, you look at a lot of economic issues and relationships between countries, and Great Britain, you know, UK, it's a trading country, you know, rules, colonies everywhere at the time. I mean, less now than then, but they quickly, their legions were dropped to Israel, and they did trading with Syria, Jordan, and they did, I shouldn't say Syria for the most part, it was Jordan, Iran, and to the lesser part Iraq. Kuwait had a bunch of these, I'll talk about that. Mark 5s, predominantly, with this massive gun. But you know, I talked about how, at the risk of bouncing around here, because there's so much interesting stuff in this design. I shared with you about the road wheels on the side. I shared with you about the cannons, extremely accurate. But look at the front end of this. This is different. No tank had been developed like this. And look at right here. Where's the mantlet? Where's the mantlet? You see the one over there? Because all these tanks have a mantlet. You don't have this. It's like a needle. This was so new, this was so innovative, that they had tarps covering it up, so you know, for as long as they could. And look down here. Look at the slope. Remember we talked about T-34 having sloping armor? Sloping armor, for those of you that aren't aware of it, if you take a 2-inch board, 2-inch thick board, say like that, and you want to drill through it, you drill through it, you take a drill, you drill through 2 inches of board. But if you put that on an angle, put it on a 45-degree angle, and drill in the same plane as you did when it was upright, you've got to go through almost twice as much wood because you're drilling on an angle. Same thing when you have a projectile coming out of a cannon and it hits the armor. There's about 5 inches of armor if you measured it. Not like this, because it's like this. You measured it straight through. It's about 5 inches. If you try to pierce it from over there from a tank that might be a kilometer away, you've got to go through close to 15 inches of armor here. Because of that same principle as the wood I explained going sideways. It's amazing. Now to do that, you know how you drive a car, you're like this. Okay, try driving the car, flip the seat back, and you go right to the back in the recliner. When you're driving this, you're laying down. I'm amazed that, you know, Grant, when he drives it, doesn't fall asleep. We keep throwing water on him so it doesn't, no, I'm joking. Down there, I mean, it's amazing. I mean, the driver has infrared. You see the red, you see there's headlights and then there's the dark lights too, that's infrared. That's for the driver and the commander, just to see the road ahead. That's short range infrared. The armor, it was innovative. And they used to put a bin at the front so people couldn't, you know, again, the Soviets or, I don't know, would-be spies or something wouldn't see that, not right away. Because it was an arms race back then. This was so innovative, so innovative. Now, if we talk about let's talk about some of the systems here. Okay, when this first came out, how do you know the range when you're firing? You're looking, you're thinking, well, how far away is that? Should the cannon be there? How do you get that crosshair on the target? Well, it first came out, there was a machine gun. It was like a 50 cal machine gun that fired a burst of 3 rounds. And it was trace, and trace only goes out maybe 1,000 meters. And then they had trace with an explosive tip, because the trace would burn out, but if the shell kept going, when it hit, so you could see, it would give so the gunner could see the burst. So the idea of 3 rounds is the 50 cal type machine gun that would be here going boom, 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 and the gunner's looking down there and he would see boom, boom, you'd see roughly where it is. He would sit there and put the crosshairs in the middle of where the hit was, and then boom, you hit the master weapon. That's the thing that happened. That's the first way of doing it. Not the most efficient, but that was the most technologically advanced system at the time. Then they came out with a very elaborate infrared rangefinder. Then they could enter that into their firing system. And with the rangefinder, they knew exactly how far away. They didn't have to look at a 50 cal and how, and assume that it would be the same type of thing. And what they did was they got rid of that, and the rangefinder was good for 10 kilometers, which far exceeded the effective range of the weapon. And being laser, it was straight as an arrow. And then once they knew it, then they would look at the distance, it would be put into their firing system, and then the cannon would be calculated. And that was an ongoing change. Remember I said there was about 1,000 improvements in this thing. A lot of it was in the gunnery, and a lot of it was in the armor. So that's the firing. So what do you do at night? Well, at night, I don't think this is going to show, but I'm going to try. This is a laser projector. On this Chieftain here. Okay, I'm looping you up. You see what Jeremy's pointing at? That there is different than this one here. That's a big, that door would open up, and it looks like kind of a searchlight, but it's not. It's a big infrared. And that infrared would let you see at night. It will be good at night, up to about 1 kilometer to 1.5 kilometers, 1 to 1.5 kilometers, and then the gunner would be able to target seeing that and take out the enemy. So at night, you could look ahead. It wouldn't be effective in bad weather and stuff like that. You'd need a clear night to be able to take out an enemy at that kind of range. So that was the system. This is the upgraded Mark 10. So what's the difference between the 10 and the 11? Well, the big difference is, again, in the firing system. Not only did the firing system, that's the computer system inside, evolve, but they introduced this. This right here, and this is thermal. This is they call it the TOGS, Thermal Observation Gunnery System. This housing would open up, and you had now a heat sensor. This is the same system that's still used today, TOGS. As a matter of fact, all of this, the cannon has been deactivated. There's pins through it so that, you don't just put live tanks out in the public. And the TOGS system is not 100% there because it's still classified. And it's interesting because I went online and I tried to find out what's the range of the TOGS. What's the range of that? I can't find out. I do know it's really significant, but I can't find out. There's something on YouTube, because this system that I just described to you, this cannon, this way, with this firing system, with the TOGS, the thermal imaging, it picks up heat. So you've probably seen, have you ever seen attack helicopters on some of those videos, and they're using the heat sensors, and you see the men, or you can even see cows in the field? Well, this is what it picks up, and you can't hide from that. It's there. Vehicles can't hide. You'd have to have an ice-cold vehicle that hasn't been running forever, just sitting there, and it wouldn't pick it up. People, this picks up people. It's that sensitive. There was one thing on YouTube, and they were talking about the Queen's Royal Irish Hussars, and it was Colonel Donardo, I believe is his name, and he was at Bovington Tank Museum, and he had a number of his second in command and his squadron commanders, and they were all having a chat about what went on during the Gulf War. And they asked them about the TOGS, and they asked them about how did it feel. And they got through the burn when it first started, and they all stopped because they had a report that there was an enemy brigade or two advancing on them. So this was in the dead of night. They stopped. They were all line abreast. All the tanks were out. These were Challenger 1s. Okay, the next evolution of this tank, with Chobram armor on it, but the same gun and the same system. And they had this, and they were looking, and they could see all of these as the tanks come up, and I don't know the range, I'm guessing 2-3 kilometers, and they could see them all on the screen. And the order came through to pick their targets, and they all fired at once. And they had what they called a whiteout on their screens, where it was black and you would see the different spots where it would show heat. The whole thing had a whiteout for about a minute, and then it calmed down, and then they individually took out the targets. They were taking out targets that had no idea where they were firing from, had no idea that they were even there. But not only did they have this kind of system that the Iraqis did not have at all, but they also had something that was used for the very first time, GPS. You take that for granted. I get that on my phone. You know, GPS. Most cars have it. No one had even really heard of it much. The Iraqi military couldn't figure out how do these guys show up out of nowhere and do what they do. So it was kind of a one-sided effect there. Anyways, coming back to this, when the Russians introduced their T-64, and it had 120, there's a couple of Russian tanks and 125 millimeter cannons, and they were taking out the Chieftains, not the British ones, but the ones that the British sold, the Iranians. The Iraqis had Soviet equipment, and they were going up against the Iranians. In the Iranian-Iraqi War, it was in 1980 to 1988. And after that, this did not do well against them. And the hits were not down here that went through, the hits were in the turret. And there's plenty of holes right through it. And the engines were a problem. I'm going to tell you about the engines in a moment. The Achilles heel of this vehicle is the engine. And the development of it, and the design, and we'll get to that in a second. So the British designers, they all went over to Iran to have a look at it. Iran bought 700 and change, 700 of these vehicles, Mark 3s and 5s. And when they got into a conflict, and the Iraqis had a more advanced Russian tank, the T-64, with a 125 high velocity round, they said they had to do something. So what you're looking at here, what I'm standing on here, is additional armor that's been added. And you'll notice it's more distinct over here on that one, the Mark 10. It's a big chunk of, it's molded steel, and it has a layer of rubber on the inside, and it's bolted into it, and then covered over. This would take a hit from these big guns. So what they've done is they Mark 10s and 11s, they automatically got an upgrade. And the armor is called Still Brew. Now Still Brew, I thought it was a microbrewery, and they got some, like, in case we have Armored Ale. I don't know if you know that, but our museum, we have a brewery that brews Armored Ale, and we sell it, and 25 cents under every can of beer goes to the museum. It's kind of a nice perk for us. But Still Brew, it was Colonel Still, and there was a guy by the name of Brewer. They come through and they designed this additional armor that was mounted, mounted onto the front of the turret. Again, it was fairly, they kept it fairly hidden and fairly quiet and low-key as well, because they didn't want to let people know that. But there is a distinct difference in the application of it on this and on that, but the basic shape is the same, and that extended the life of it. The whole thing about these is to, it's action-reaction. I mentioned that before. The Soviets did something better, then the Allies did something different. Then the Soviets said, oh, they just did something better than us, then they do something better, and that's kind of where the whole race went on, the whole weapons race and stuff. Now, one thing I didn't mention to you about the cannon. What also made this unique is the actual round itself. You're probably used to seeing a big brass casing and a big kind of shell projectile, or if you looked at a gun, you had a brass casing, you had a bullet into that gun. cannon, you got just a big version of that. And some guy's in the back and he throws it in. Not so with this gun. This is the first gun that actually come out this way. It actually is a they call it two-part, but it's really a three-part. So the first part is the head. And that's that one there. And there's 3 kinds of ammunition. There's probably 10 different variants, but 3 main kinds. One is a HESH, high explosive squash head. That's not that one. But it's big, and it's too big for me to hold up here. It's heavy, and it gets thrown in, and it's just a projectile. And then a bag of propellant gets pushed in behind it. You close the breech, and then there's a magazine underneath that holds like 50 cal blank rounds that fires a blank, and you're good for 10 of them. And it would actually fire it. And then when the breech opens up automatically, there's nothing in it. Then you put another head in. This is a sabot, armor-piercing, discarding sabot, which means when that goes out, this centerpiece here, these parts around it, point it down so they can see this in 3 parts on the end.
It's like the Price is Right.
Yeah. They flip out, and that center, which is a hardened tungsten steel, goes out that barrel like at one crazy speed, and it just punches through and does it. Then the third one is this, and this is like a needle, and there's a fin on it. It's like a dart, and there's 3 fins inside it. And when this gets fired down, and remember, this gets thrown in, then a bag of powder gets thrown in, and then you fire it. This comes apart. You can see it's hardly aerodynamic. The air hits it and it blows it open. This dart that lays inside, it's got like 3 fins on the back, it goes ballistic. And this will go in one, and they're made out of tungsten or they're made out of depleted uranium. This will go in one side of a tank and out the other. So you can see the effect of this and this. The HESH round that I mentioned before. HESH round, it's almost like a universal thing. High explosive squash head. So what that means is, that's the great big thing. There's a 2-part explosion thing in it. When you fire it and it hits a tank, it squashes on the tank. And in a millisecond, then the explosion goes off. And what it kind of, the squash means it forms a barrier, like, you know, of metal, and then the explosion goes off. It may not pierce the armor if the armor is like this, but it doesn't need to. The shock wave it puts in flicks off scabs. They call it metal scabs inside, and they flick all around all inside, and that's what injures people. It puts them out of commission. But that's also used for taking out buildings. That's also used for helping infantry to be like an artillery piece. So this weapon here, and we have British veterans come over here all the time. And I'll tell you a story. Les Critchlow, he helped us do this, and he helps us with a lot of the British stuff that we bring over. He told me a story. I said, tell me a story, Les. What did you do on that? He says, well, we do the high ellipse. I says, high ellipse, what's that? Well, when you're into gunnery and trajectory and you know, he's forgotten more than I'll ever know. There's everything to do with an ellipse, and that's the arc of the round. When you put a HESH round in, you don't put the same size bag of powder or charge as you do for these ones. You put a much lower one because it's a HESH round. You don't need the high velocity. The hit is in the explosion part, the high explosive. So they're out on the ranges, and this is 82, 83. He's a young lad, and they were firing HESH. Now, when you fire these, they go straight for a long time. With HESH, you got to put the barrel up because it lobs. It lobs because you don't have as much propellant. So they were on the ranges, and he says it's a 5-round event. I don't know if he used the word event. 5 rounds, and they were shooting at under a hull of a Sherman tank, like that one there. It was a range target. The first round, he said, it was to the left and a little shy. So they adjusted. This was at about 7,000, 8,000 meters, which is crazy. And you would only do this on a range. In an actual battle, and I'll tell you about a record that's held by these vehicles, these guns, in a moment. But he would go out there, that length, that distance, because you know, you've got all the computers working for you and everything. The first round was off, so they made an adjustment. The second round, this barrel's up like this. The second round went right in the middle. So now they had their bearings. Now they had it laid on the target. So then what they did was, they fired 3 rapid rounds, and because of the slow trajectory and the arcing, they had 3 in the air before the first one hit. So then the last one they fired, the barrel's coming down, and they're looking at it and they go boom, and then boom and boom. There are some artillery pieces, not this, we don't have anything like it, where they can actually, they're so fast and responsive, you can actually fire up to 5 rounds and change the trajectory, and they'll all hit at the same time. That sounds crazy. That's not what they did with this. But I'm just telling you the technology and where it's gone. But coming back to it, they called it high ellipse, and that's where, for artillery, if you have an enemy position, you think about it. They could get all those rounds, and before the enemy can find out where you're firing from, you could have your engines go, you could get the heck out of there quick. Because those rounds are going to hit, you're going to get 3 rounds hitting, and then you got to get your butt out of there before something happens. So, this here, it wouldn't be fair if I didn't talk about this. This is the mainstay, this is a boiling vessel. Boiling vessel. This was, like, this plugs in, to the electrical system of the tank. You can, they love their tea, right? You're from the UK, you like your tea. So they would brew up a brew of tea, or you could cook your MRIs in that. This was an envy. The Americans have copied this. They have one of these, they're in Bradley fighting vehicles, they're in all their Abrams and everything. But in the Gulf War, they didn't have these. So they started saying, the British used to bring extra ones over and used to trade them for the American camp cots. Because the cots that we slept on, we've got some of them around here on the side of this tank over there, they're American design. They're a lot more comfortable than the British camp cots. The British had these stoves, these boiling vessels, as they call them, for a spot of tea, or your MRIs, or just something hot, you know, out there. So I had to show you that because that is in a very special place inside the turret where everyone can get their hands on it. Okay, so let's just talk. I mentioned that they made about 4,000 of these. They made 2,700 of the Chieftains. So about over 4,000 of the Centurions. They made 2,700 of the Chieftains. Of that, 900 of them went to British service, and this was one of the more successful export tanks that the British had. They actually they sold over 700 to Iran alone. Now the Achilles heel and one of the problems, and one of the reasons why the Iranians did not do as well against the Iraqis was the power. It's an L-60. One of the things they said was this had a Meteor engine in it. It was a very reliable, good engine, but this was a bigger tank. They needed more power, and they were afraid that they would not have gas, or they had gas, they wouldn't have diesel, so they wanted a multi-fuel. So they had Leyland come up with an idea to make an L-60 engine for this tank. It was a new type engine. God knows they had enough time to develop it right, but this was nothing but a problem. The cylinder sleeves in it, they were leaking oil. It was, you'd start this up and you'd have a big bellow of blue smoke in the initial ones. And people would, you know, it's like the enemy. If they're going to take you out, they see exactly where you are. It's like holding up a flag, shoot me here, I'm here. It was not a good thing. And it went through change, and they finally got it near right. These have got the same L-60 engines. And we've got about 3 or 4 extra ones in the back in case they crap out on us. But they pretty well got these down pat. These aren't running too bad, right? Would you agree? We
Well, there's a
got
lot of modifications over the years.
hell of a, this has got a red rocker thing on it or something. There's a special name for them. It was improved the most. But that was the biggest problem. When they first were issued to one of the tank regiments in the UK, they went out on their first exercise. 34 of them went out. 3 of them made it back. It was just an exercise, not a war. The other ones broke down. Like, it's a sad story, because this is a class act tank. This is the way a tank should look. Huge gun, sloped armor. Now this is, and those of you that are ever been involved with World of Tanks, I mean, you know, one of the celebrity experts there is the Chieftain, and he picked his name Chieftain because he learned how to drive a tank, and a Chieftain, he loves a Chieftain. This guy here is gaga over Chieftains here.
Don't know why.
He's converted me over to these things here too. I mean, look at the vehicles we have here, they're crazy good. The Russians feared these. The Russians feared these. They put their best tank regiments up against the British, who had these. They put the M60s, like American troops, they had the M60s. We got a green one right over there, big American M60. And the Germans and the Canadians, we had the Leopards, the Leopard 1s. But this is the one they feared, not the M60s, not the Leopards here. Because this gun was accurate. This gun was so accurate. In the Gulf War, this gun, as I mentioned, was transposed over onto the Challenger 1, and that's what they used in the Gulf War, not these. Even though the Gulf War was in '91, it wasn't 4 years later when they finally got rid of all these. Cold War, you know, that had ended, you know, they didn't have a need. They had enough Challenger 1s and Challenger 2s. They didn't need to keep the Chieftains going as well, because it's a costly venture. But this weapon on the Challenger 1, there's varying tales, and there's 2 regiments that claim it, British regiments that claim it, but the range to a kill shot in the field, not in a range, them pulling up and setting everything up, you know, taking a lot of time to do it. But I think one report said 5,500 meters. Another one says 5,800 meters. That's way out there. I mean, that's beyond anything realistic. On the ranges, you can far exceed that, but you're in an ideal world. So these things, this in my opinion, is amazing. We don't have any tank here with this size. This is the most modern tank we actually have here. The rest are still being in service. It's tough to get a hold of it. I'll say one other thing. When the Iraqis invaded Kuwait in August of 1990, the Kuwaitis were taken by total surprise. They had about 300 of these, the Kuwaitis. There was one regiment, ironically, I think it might have been the 34th Regiment, similar to our 34th Battalion. They were not taken by surprise. Well, they were, but they were able to get, I think it was 32 tanks, partially refueled and partially reloaded with ammo. And they were able to set up a defensive perimeter. And the Iraqis were very aggressive coming on board. It's called the Battle of the Bridges. And the reporting on it, you got to really dig into some of these reports, and you got to figure out what's fact and what's fiction. The Iraqis, you know, after the whole thing happened, they kind of went, well, it was nothing. But the Kuwaitis, who just lost their whole country, and these Kuwaitis set up a defensive perimeter. They had artillery and they had their tanks. They had these tanks, they had this weapon, and they claimed a lot of Iraqi kills in their Soviet tanks. The funny part I thought was somewhat amusing was the fact that they were entrenched and there's such a long range. The Iraqis are bringing their tanks up on trucks, on huge trucks. But this range was so long, they're starting to unload their tanks, but they thought they were far enough away. These guys were taking out the tanks still on the trucks. They never got a chance to back the trucks up. So I thought it was kind of interesting. So there is a history of this. There's some of these that are still using. When Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, he ended up, and when he had the war with Iran, he ended up with about 100 of these tanks. he ended up scrapping a lot of them because he had Soviet stuff. And he gave quite a few of them to Jordan, King of Jordan. And Jordan, they modified them, and there are still some in service today in Jordan. Iran still has some of these in service today. Different engines. They got rid of the L60, unreliable type of engine. They still have some going. Matter of fact, some of you may have seen in the newspaper that Jordan, and I'm not sure where it was, but they just set up an artificial reef in some sea. And they dumped several of these chieftains that are sitting at the bottom of this artificial reef. So, anyways, that's up to here. Now, where did it go? Challenger 1, they went to a different engine, smartly. They went to a diesel Rolls-Royce engine, a very reliable, powerful engine. It was a very successful tank, using the same technology. Now think about it, right after the war, this was developed in the Conqueror, that great big behemoth that was so slow. This is still slow. This will do about 19 miles an hour across the country. It'll do about 30 miles an hour on a road. Still pretty slow compared to these other fast ones over here. The Challenger, they did well. They only produced, I'll just tell you right now, the production rate for, Challenger 1, 420 of them. Challenger 2, 446. That's it. Chieftain, they produced 2,281 of these. Told you 900. So that's where they are today. Today, you'll notice this, those of you that weren't here before, you notice this weird camouflage pattern. That was developed, and that came from the ranks up. And it was suggested that they're in the Berlin, it was the Berlin Squadron, isolated, if you recall, before the Cold War ended. Berlin was in the middle of East Germany, so it was all surrounded by communist forces. There's no forests and rivers and massive trees, and so this kind of camouflage did nothing. That did everything. Those were tough to find. You see pictures of these in an urban setting, it's tough to pick them out. So anyways, right now, and it was just released, a buddy of mine, one of the British veterans, sent me a bunch of pictures. He says, don't share these because it's still classified. And then he just texted me last week and he says, oh, you can share them now. I've just seen them. They've been released online. And what they've done is they took a Challenger 2, same cannon, same talk system, modified, upgraded, but basically the same thing, with the Chobram armor, and they put this pattern on it that was only before it was on Chieftains in Berlin, and it's called Street Fighter. They nicknamed the tank Street Fighter, and what they did, they want the infantry to be able to work with them in the field, and when you go into an urban setting, not in the country, but an urban setting, how are you going to fight an enemy that's around a tree and around a building and in a sewer or something like that? So they actually put screens, cameras on the front. There's a camera on the tip of the barrel, so you can go and peek around the corner with the camera and see what's around the corner. So you don't have to pull your tank out to look. You don't have to have an infantry guy go look. You got a camera there. And on the back of the tank, there's a big LED screen. So the infantry can see what's ahead of them instead of sticking their head out and looking if someone's shooting at them. So you get the tank for protection. Interestingly enough, on the back of both of these vehicles, there's a box. You reach in the box, you pull out a telephone, a handset. You push a button in the box, it rings up. The radio op in there, and you go, hi, how are you? This is more cooperative, more user-friendly with the infantry. When they went to Challenger 1, Challenger 2, they dropped them. They didn't have the telephones on the back anymore. Even the Leopards have the telephones on the back. But somehow the British got rid of that. So now they're bringing it back, but now they've got LED screens. You're actually, you're FaceTiming the driver and stuff. It's crazy. So I'm just giving you the evolution. We went for Centurion, 1943 requirements, be able to withstand an 88 hit. using components on here with the suspension, taking the Conqueror, which was to support the Centurion, using the heavy-duty gun, it's a rifle barrel. It was state-of-the-art. Come out in early 60s, and it wasn't until 1979 the Germans come out with a 120 millimeter smoothbore. And that's what the Americans use on their Abrams. It's a 120 millimeter smoothbore. The British stuck with the 120 millimeter rifle for different reasons. Some people say one's better than the other. It's a matter of opinion. And then we went from here with this weapon system to the Challenger one, and it carried over to the Challenger 2, and they still are using the same type of weapon system here, upgrading all the time. So that's World War II to the present, to the street fighter. That's an experimental thing that they're doing with the British infantry and the British armored units. So thank you very much for coming.
Here we go. Clear.